The desert burned at 118 degrees Fahrenheit. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison lay face down in the sand, her blood pooling beneath her in a slowly expanding circle that the parched earth drank greedily. Shrapnel from the RPG that had vaporized the lead Humvee protruded from her left thigh, a jagged piece of steel approximately 4 inches long, buried deep enough to scrape femur. 2 of her ribs were fractured, possibly 3. Each breath felt like swallowing broken glass. Around her, the convoy had become a graveyard. The M1151 Humvee that had been traveling 30 meters ahead was now a column of black smoke rising into the bleached Afghan sky. Secondary explosions from the ammunition cook-off sent brass and steel fragments singing through the air every few seconds. The acrid smell of burning rubber, fuel, and something worse, something she learned to recognize in her years of combat, but never grew accustomed to, filled her nostrils. Sarah tried to move. Her body refused. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions. AK-47s. The distinctive crack of the 7.62 by 39 millimeters round unmistakable to anyone who'd spent time downrange. Voices shouted in Pashto. Coordinates being called. Positions being marked. The ambush had been perfectly executed. RPG first to stop the lead vehicle, then small arms to pin down the survivors, then, "We need to move. Now!" The voice belonged to Captain Jake Reeves, the Army convoy commander. Sarah heard boots crunching on gravel, heard the grunt of men lifting wounded, heard the diesel growl of the surviving MRAP beginning to reverse. She tried to call out. Her voice came as a whisper. "Here!" No one heard. "I've got Thompson and Diaz," someone shouted. "Peterson's gone." "What about that one?" Another voice, younger. Scared. Sarah felt a shadow fall over her. A boot nudged her shoulder, rolling her slightly. The movement sent white-hot agony through her ribcage, but she managed to open her eyes. She saw desert boots, ACU pants. Couldn't lift her head high enough to see a face. "Check her pulse," Reeves ordered. 2 fingers pressed against her neck. She was alive. She knew she was alive, but her pulse was thready, weak, blood pressure dropping from the volume she'd lost into sand. "Barely there, sir." "No patches, no identification." "She's not ours." "What do you mean she's not ours?" "No unit insignia, no rank, no name tape. Nothing. She's not on my manifest." That was by design. Sarah was operating under covert protocols. SEAL Team 6 personnel embedded with conventional forces didn't advertise. Her combat uniform had been deliberately stripped of all identifying markers before the mission. Standard operating procedure for Tier 1 operators moving through contested space. Anonymity meant security. It also, in this moment, meant she was nobody. "She's bleeding out," the younger voice said. We need to get our people out of here." Reeves cut him off. "I'm not risking the convoy for someone who isn't even supposed to be here. She's non-viable. Leave her." The words hit Sarah harder than the shrapnel. "Non-viable. Leave her." "Sir, we can't just." "That's an order." "Specialist, get to the vehicle. We're falling back to Rally Point Bravo." The shadow moved away. The boots crunched back toward the surviving vehicles. Sarah tried to reach out, tried to grab an ankle, tried to scream. But all that came out was a wet cough, blood speckling the sand in front of her face. She heard doors slamming, heard the MRAP's engine roar, heard the convoy begin to move, tires spinning, then gripping, then accelerating north, away from her. The gunfire intensified as the enemy fighters turned their attention from the retreating vehicles to the prizes they had left behind. Sarah heard the screams first. American soldiers who'd been too wounded to evacuate, now at the mercy of men who had none. The screams didn't last long. They were coming. 30 feet. Maybe less. Sarah Morrison, call sign Ghost, pressed her face into the sand and did something she hadn't done since her father's funeral. She prayed. If that opening hooked you, trust me, this story only gets more intense. Subscribe now for more incredible stories of courage, resilience, and the warriors who refuse to quit. Hit that notification bell so you never miss one. Now, let me take you back to where Sarah's story really began. 12 hours earlier, forward operating base Phantom had been quiet. The kind of quiet that made experienced operators nervous. The silence before violence. The calm that preceded the storm. Sarah had learned to read that silence the way other people read newspapers. It spoke of ambushes being planned, of IEDs being buried, of coordinates being whispered into satellite phones that would ring in caves 100 miles away. She'd been cleaning her Sig Sauer P226 when the summons came. The weapon was immaculate. It always was. 15 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber, 16 total. She could field strip and reassemble it in under 30 seconds. She'd fired over 10,000 rounds through this particular pistol over the course of her career, and it had never failed her. Not once. Not when the primary went down. Not when close was measured in inches rather than feet. The M4A1 carbine leaning against her cot was equally pristine. EOTech holographic sight zeroed at 50 meters, and /PQ, 15 laser module mounted on the top rail, surefire suppressor threaded on the barrel. She'd made her bones with that rifle. Confirmed kills at ranges that would have impressed most snipers. But nobody knew that. Nobody at FOB Phantom knew who she was, what she'd done, or why she was there. To them, she was just another attachment from some alphabet agency, CIA, DI, one of the dozens of acronyms that populated the intelligence landscape. She wore no rank. She offered no explanations. She kept to herself, spoke only when necessary, and watched everything with eyes that had seen too much to ever truly rest. That anonymity was the price of her profession. SEAL Team 6, officially known as the United States Naval Special Warfare Development Group, DevGru, didn't advertise. They didn't give interviews. They didn't pose for photographs. They operated in the shadows, and they liked it that way. The men and women who wore the trident did so, with the understanding that their victories would be classified, their sacrifices unknown, their names remembered only by those who'd served beside them. Sarah had earned that trident the hard way. 14 years of service. The first female operator to complete the full SEAL pipeline and advanced selection, not the administrative or support roles that had been open to women in previous years, but the actual door-kicking, trigger-pulling, high-value target extracting tip of the spear. She'd endured Hell Week when her class started with 187 candidates and finished with 19. She'd survived the 18-month operator training course when instructors actively tried to break her, betting pools running on which evolution would finally send her packing. She never packed. They'd call her Ghost because she moved without sound, killed without warning, and disappeared without trace. The name had been given to her during her first deployment, when she'd single-handedly neutralized an enemy sniper who'd been terrorizing a Marine outpost for 3 weeks. She'd low-crawled through 900 meters of open terrain over 4 hours, taken a shot at 1,100 meters, and exfiltrated before anyone knew she'd been there. The sniper's spotter never saw her coming. Neither did the 3 fighters who tried to intercept her extraction. For confirmed kills, 0 witnesses, Ghost. But the skills that made her legendary in the special operations community meant nothing at FOB Phantom. Here, she was just another face in crowd, another transient operator passing through on business that wasn't anyone's concern. The Army personnel who staffed the base gave her a wide berth, not out of respect, but out of confusion. She didn't fit into their organizational chart, and that made her invisible. The summons had come from Commander Marcus Webb via encrypted satellite link. Webb was her commanding officer at Dam Neck, the Virginia Beach compound where DevGru made its home. He was 53 years old, a 30-year veteran of naval special warfare, and one of the few people on Earth who knew everything Sarah Morrison had accomplished. He'd been her advocate when the brass tried to block her advancement. He'd been her mentor when the weight of what she'd seen threatened to crush her. He'd been the one who'd recommended her for the Silver Star she'd never officially received because the operation that earned it never officially happened. His voice had been calm when she'd answered the call. Ghost, I need you on a convoy. Sir, Army's running a resupply mission to combat Outpost Kestrel tomorrow morning. 12 vehicles, 36 personnel. They're moving through the Ghazni corridor. Sarah had felt her stomach tighten. The Ghazni corridor was notorious. A 60-kilometer stretch of road that wound through mountain passes and desert flats where the Taliban had ambushed more convoys than anyone cared to count. It was a kind of route that required air cover, route clearance, and QRF on standby. It was not the kind of route you sent a single SEAL operator to babysit. What's the objective? Intelligence suggests HVD movement in the area. We got signals that Mahmoud al-Rashid maybe transiting through a village along the convoy route sometime in the next 48 hours. Al-Rashid, the name sent ice through her veins. Mahmoud al-Rashid was a bomb maker responsible for more American deaths than any single individual since the invasion. His IEDs had killed 4 members of Sarah's first team. His suicide vests had murdered a classroom of Afghan girls who dared to learn to read. His vehicle-borne explosives had destroyed a medical clinic in Kandahar, killing 2 American nurses and 47 civilians. He'd been on DevGru's high-value target list for 6 years. We've had al-Rashid sightings before, Sarah said carefully. They never pan out. This one's different. Sijin intercepted a call from a satellite phone 3 hours ago. He's moving to a new location, and the only viable route takes him through a village called Kaladiko. The convoy will pass within 4 kilometers of that village tomorrow. You want me to spot and verify? I want you to verify and, if opportunity presents, eliminate. You'll have ISR support. Reaper drone overhead. Call Sign Spectre. 7. If al-Rashid shows, you'll have a 10-minute window to confirm identity and take the shot before the convoy clears the area. And if he doesn't show, then you complete the escort and return to base. But Ghost, Webb's voice had hardened. This might be our last chance. Al-Rashid is dying. Cancer, stage 4. He's tried to train a replacement before he goes. If we don't get him now, his legacy continues. His methods live on. More Americans die. Sarah had been silent for a long moment. Rules of engagement? Standard DevGru protocols. You are authorized to operate independently. The convoy commander, Captain Jake Reeves, has been notified that you're a liaison officer from a joint task force. He doesn't know your actual status. He doesn't need to know. You observe, you report, and if the opportunity presents, you act. Questions? Negative, sir. One more thing, Ghost. Webb's voice had softened just slightly. Your father will be proud. The words had hit her like a physical blow. Master Chief Daniel Morrison had been a SEAL for 24 years before an IED in Ramadi ended his career and, 6 months later, his life. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but Sarah knew the truth. The blast had damaged something deeper than tissue, something that medicine couldn't reach and time couldn't heal. Her father had come home broken in ways that didn't show on x-rays, and he'd spent his final months watching himself fade, powerless to stop it. She'd been 19 when he died. She'd enlisted 3 days later. Not because she wanted to follow in his footsteps. She'd already planned to do that since she was 12 years old. Watching him leave for deployments with the same quiet stoicism he'd bring to everything he did. She'd enlisted because she understood, in that raw, grief-torn moment, that the only way to honor him was to become what he'd been. Not a shadow of him, not a tribute to him, but someone who could stand beside his memory as an equal. The path had nearly destroyed her. Bud/S, basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, was designed to break people. That was the point. The instructors didn't want candidates who could survive Hell Week. They wanted candidates who could thrive in conditions that would kill ordinary humans. They wanted warriors who would keep fighting when their bodies had long since surrendered, who would swim through hypothermic waters at 0300 because quitting wasn't an option, who would carry 200-pound logs until their shoulders separated because the only easy day was yesterday. Sarah had been the only woman in her class. She'd also been the youngest, the smallest, the one everyone expected to fail. The instructors had targeted her specifically, not because they were cruel, though some of them were, but because they needed to know. They needed to know if she could handle the pressure that would come when she was the only woman in a stack of 8 operators breaching an enemy compound. They needed to know if she could perform when lives depended on her and failure meant flag-draped coffins. They needed to know if she was there because she wanted to be there or because she had something to prove. She'd proven it. Hell Week had been exactly what the name suggested. 5.5 days of continuous training on 4 hours of total sleep, cold water immersion, long-distance runs in soft sand, surf torture that left candidates shivering so violently their teeth cracked. 37 candidates from her class had quit during that evolution alone. They walked to the bell, rang it 3 times, and surrendered their helmets. Sarah had watched them go. She hadn't judged them, couldn't judge them. Quitting wasn't weakness. It was self-knowledge. Those men had discovered their limits, and their limits had come before the bell. There was no shame in that. The only shame would have been continuing past the point of safety, risking the lives of teammates who might have to carry you. But her limits hadn't come. They'd push her past exhaustion, past pain, past anything she thought herself capable of enduring. They put her through evolutions designed specifically to exploit what they perceived as her weaknesses, upper body strength deficits, height disadvantages, the psychological warfare of isolation. They woken her at 0200 for punishment PT when she hadn't done anything wrong, just to see how she'd respond to injustice. She'd responded by performing, not by complaining, not by citing regulations or filing grievances, just by being better than they expected every single time, until their expectations recalibrated and they stopped seeing a woman trying to prove something and started seeing an operator earning her place. The trident had been pinned to her chest on a Tuesday morning in Coronado. She remembered the exact moment, the weight of the gold insignia against her uniform, the click as Commander Webb pressed the pins through fabric and into the cork backing beneath. He'd looked her in the eye and said 3 words, "Your father's daughter." She'd almost broken down right there. But SEALs didn't break down. Not in public. Not where others could see. They compartmentalized. They filed their emotions in boxes and locked those boxes away until there was time and space to open them safely. So she nodded once sharply and turned to face the assembled crowd of her peers. None of them had applauded. That had confused her until later, when one of the veterans explained. Applause means you've done something special. You didn't do anything special, Morrison. You just met the standard. We all meet the standard. That's what we do. She'd understood then. The military didn't care what you looked like, where you came from, or what obstacles you'd overcome. It cared about results. It cared about whether you could do the job when lives hung in the balance. Everything else was noise. For the next decade, Sarah had proven that she could do the job. 18 deployments, operations in 11 countries, missions that would remain classified until long after she was dead. She'd breached compounds in Pakistan and safe houses in Yemen and mountain hideouts in places that didn't appear on any official map. She'd treated wounded teammates under fire and carried them to extraction when their legs no longer worked. She'd lost count of the enemies she'd killed and made peace with that loss because counting would have meant caring, and caring would have meant questioning, and questioning would have meant hesitation that got good people killed. She was a weapon, finely tuned and expertly maintained. But weapons didn't need respect. That had been the hardest lesson. Harder than Hell Week, harder than the advanced training, harder than any of the physical challenges that had tested her body. The hardest lesson was understanding that no matter how much she accomplished, there would always be people who saw her gender before they saw her qualifications. There would always be briefing rooms that went quiet when she entered, assumptions that she was administrative staff or a translator or someone's girlfriend who'd wandered into the wrong building. She'd learned to use that invisibility. If they underestimated her, that was their mistake. She would move through their blind spots and accomplish objectives while they were still trying to figure out who she was. She would be the operator nobody saw coming because they weren't looking for her in the first place. Ghost. The name had become more than a call sign. It had become an identity. Now, lying in the Afghan sand with her blood soaking into the earth, that identity felt like a curse. The convoy had been 45 minutes out of FOB Phantom when the ambush triggered. They'd been traveling in tactical formation, 3 MRAPs, 5 M1151 Humvees, for supply trucks, and a fuel tanker bringing up the rear. Sarah had positioned herself in the 4th vehicle, maintaining visibility on the road ahead, while staying close enough to the center of the convoy to respond to threats from either direction. Her M4A1 had been prepped for engagement. Her comms had been active, monitoring both the convoy's internal frequency and the encrypted channel to Spectre 7, the Reaper drone orbiting at 18,000 feet. She'd been watching the terrain scroll past, boulder fields giving way to open desert, occasional mud brick villages visible in the distance, the road itself a pale ribbon of packed dirt cutting through the brown expanse. Everything had been normal until it wasn't. The RPG had come from the northeast, a Chinese-made Type 69. She'd identified from the smoke's signature in the half-second before impact. It had struck the lead Humvee's engine block at an angle designed to maximize kinetic transfer, detonating with a flash that temporarily blinded everyone within 100 meters. Sarah's vehicle had braked hard, trying to avoid the wreckage. They'd almost made it. The driver, A young specialist named Taylor, whose name she learned only that morning, had yanked the wheel left, trying to swing around a burning Humvee and clear the kill zone. But the Taliban had planned for that. The secondary IED had been buried 6 feet off the road's left shoulder, pressure activated, positioned exactly where a vehicle trying to evade the roadblock would go. The blast had lifted the Humvee 3 feet off the ground. Sarah remembered the sensation of weightlessness, that strange, surreal moment when gravity released its grip and physics took over. She remembered the windshield exploding inward, glass fragments peppering her face and arms. She remembered the door next to her buckling, metal screaming as it deformed, something punching through and into her thigh with a pain so immediate and so total that her vision went white. Then she was in the sand. No memory of how she'd gotten there. No memory of the vehicle landing, rolling, stopping. Just sand in her mouth, blood in her eyes, and the distant sound of gunfire growing closer. She'd tried to move. Her legs hadn't responded. The shrapnel in her thigh was the problem. She'd understood that immediately, her combat medic training kicking in even as her conscious mind struggled to process the trauma. The piece of steel had nicked the femoral artery, not severed it. If it had severed it, she'd already be dead, but compromised enough that blood was leaving her body faster than her circulatory system could compensate. She had maybe 10 minutes before hypovolemic shock rendered her unconscious. Maybe 15 if she was lucky. She needed a tourniquet. She needed pressure. She needed to stop the bleeding before it stopped her. Her IFAK, individual first aid kit, was still attached to her plate carrier. She could feel it pressing against her hip, the familiar weight of supplies that had saved lives before and might now save hers. But reaching it required movement, and movement required energy she wasn't sure she had. The AK-47 fire was getting closer. Sarah closed her eyes and focused on her breathing. Tactical breathing. 4 counts in. For counts hold. For counts out. For counts hold. Slow the heart rate. Reduce blood loss. By time. Then she'd heard Captain Reeves. Then she'd heard the words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. No patches, no identification. She's not ours. She's non-viable. Leave her. The betrayal had cut deeper than the shrapnel. She understood triage. She'd made those decisions herself, choosing which wounded to prioritize, which casualties to stabilize, which soldiers were beyond saving. Combat forced hard choices, and judging those choices from a distance was the luxury of people who'd never had to make them. But this wasn't triage. This was abandonment. Reeves hadn't left her because she couldn't be saved. He'd left her because he didn't know who she was. Because she didn't have a patch on her shoulder or a name on her chest. Because the anonymity that protected her mission had made her disposable. And now his convoy was gone, Rally Point Bravo 12 kilometers to the north, and Sarah Morrison was alone in a kill zone with enemy fighters 30 feet away and getting closer. She opened her eyes. The sun was directly overhead, brutal and unforgiving. Through the heat shimmer, she could see shapes moving among the burning vehicles. 2 men, maybe 3, picking through the wreckage. One of them held an AK-47 casually, the way a person might hold a broom. The others were bent over something on the ground. A body, she realized. They were going through pockets, stripping gear, looking for intelligence, or looking for survivors. Sarah heard a shot, then another. They were executing the wounded. The third scream was cut short by a burst of automatic fire. She heard laughter after that, male voices, satisfied, the sound of men doing work they enjoyed. They were moving methodically, vehicle to vehicle, checking pulses, and then eliminating them. They would reach her in minutes. Sarah's hand moved to her plate carrier. Her fingers found the IFAK pouch. The zipper made almost no sound as she pulled open, her movement slow and deliberate, minimizing any visual signature that might draw attention. Inside, she found what she needed. Combat gauze, hemostatic dressing, infused with kaolin to accelerate clotting. Tourniquet, CAT model, the standard issue for special operations forces. Pressure bandage, chest seal, quick clot powder, nasopharyngeal airway, shears, everything she needed to save her own life, if she could stay conscious long enough to use it. The tourniquet went on first. Sarah's hands were shaking, blood loss, adrenaline, the body's natural response to trauma, but her training took over. The CAT tourniquet was designed to be applied one-handed, and she'd practiced a motion thousands of times in training scenarios that never quite captured the reality of doing it while bleeding out in enemy territory. She slid the loop over her boot, worked up to her upper thigh, positioned it 2 inches above the shrapnel wound. The placement was critical. Too low, and it wouldn't stop arterial bleeding. Too high, and she'd risk damaging nerves she might need later. She pulled the windlass tight, feeling the pressure build, watching the flow of blood slow and then stop. The pain was indescribable. A tourniquet works by compressing tissue until blood can no longer flow. It saves lives, but it does so by essentially crushing everything in its path. Muscles, nerves, vessels, all squeeze into a compressed mass of agony. The official guidance said you could leave a tourniquet in place for up to 2 hours without risking permanent damage. But Sarah had seen tourniquets cause compartment syndrome in less time than that. 2 hours. She checked her watch. The crystal was cracked, but the digital display still worked. 1,342 hours. 2 hours gave her until 1542. After that, even if she survived, she might lose a leg. She filed that information away and reached for the combat gauze. The shrapnel was still embedded in her thigh. Removing it wasn't an option, not without surgical tools and sterile conditions. But she could pack the wound around it, applying the hemostatic agent to the lacerated tissue and hoping the clotting factors would do their job. Working by feel, she pushed the gauze into the wound. Her vision went gray. She bit down on her own lip hard enough to draw blood, using the smaller pain to override the larger one. The gray receded. Her hands kept moving. Pack, press. When the wound was full of gauze, she wrapped the pressure bandage over everything, pulling it tight enough to maintain compression without cutting off circulation entirely. The final product was ugly, blood-soaked fabric and medical tape, the kind of battlefield dressing that would make any hospital corpsman wince. But it was functional. The arterial bleed was controlled. Now she had to deal with the ribs. She probed her own chest with careful fingers, mapping the damage. 2 ribs broken for certain. She could feel the grating of bone against bone with each breath. Possibly a 3rd cracked, but not displaced. No subcutaneous emphysema, which meant her lung was probably intact. No sucking chest wound. No tension pneumothorax. No immediate threat to breathing beyond the pain that made each inhalation feel like torture. She could survive this, if the enemy didn't find her first. The voices were closer now. Sarah risked a glance toward the wreckage. The 3 fighters had finished with the vehicles and were spreading out, searching the area for anyone who might have been thrown clear. They moved with the confidence of men who knew the terrain, who had done this before, who expected nothing but victims. One of them was walking directly toward her position. 30 feet. 25. 20. Sarah's hand moved her Sig Sauer. The pistol was still in its holster, somehow undamaged despite the blast. She drew it slowly, keeping the motion small, and checked the chamber by feel. Round loaded. 15 in the magazine. 16 total. 3 targets at close range. She could take them. Center mass. Controlled pairs. 2 rounds per target with 10 remaining. Her marksmanship was good enough even in her current condition. She'd passed qualification shooting with simulated wounds far worse than this. But the moment she fired, every fighter in the area would know her position. She didn't know how many there were total. The ambush had been sophisticated. Multiple RPG teams, coordinated small arms fire, pre-positioned IEDs. That kind of operation required planning, personnel, logistics. They could have 20 fighters in the hills. 30 more. 3 confirmed kills. 10 rounds remaining. Unknown number of enemies. The math didn't work. Sarah lowered herself flat against the sand, pressing her face into the dirt, willing herself to become invisible. Her desert camouflage would help. The pattern was designed to blend with exactly this terrain. If she stayed perfectly still, if she controlled her breathing, if she didn't do anything to attract attention. The footsteps stopped. She heard the fighter's breathing, labored from walking in the heat. She heard him spit, the wet impact of saliva hitting sand less than 10 feet from her face. She heard him mutter something in Pashto, a curse maybe or a prayer. Then his radio crackled. The voice on the other end was urgent, commanding. Sarah's Pashto was functional, enough for basic interrogation and tactical communication, and she caught fragments of the conversation. American reinforcements, aircraft inbound, rally points being established. The fighter acknowledged and turned away. His footsteps receded toward the road, toward the other fighters, toward whatever vehicles they'd hidden in the hills before the ambush. Engine started. Doors slammed. Within 60 seconds, the sound of motors faded into the distance, and the kill zone fell silent. They were gone. For now. Sarah lay still for another 5 minutes, confirming the absence of threats, then slowly raised her head. The convoy was destroyed. 4 vehicles burning, 3 more riddled with enough holes to be unserviceable. Bodies lay scattered across the road. American soldiers who trusted their leadership to bring them home, now cooling in the Afghan sun. She counted 7 visible, but there could be more in the wreckage. 7 dead, because of an ambush, because of a bomb maker named Mahmoud al-Rashid, whose network had provided the intelligence and materials for this operation, because of a war that had been going on for so long that people back home had stopped paying attention, and because of Captain Jake Reeves, who'd looked at a wounded American and decided she wasn't worth saving. Sarah pushed herself up to a sitting position. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through her ribs, but she gritted her teeth and kept going. Sitting led to kneeling. Kneeling led to crouching. Crouching led to standing, though she had to lean against a piece of wreckage to keep her balance. Her leg was numb below the tourniquet. Normal, expected, temporary. She needed to move. The enemy had left, but they would return. Once they realized no American aircraft were actually inbound, once they understood the radio chatter had been their own commanders pulling them back for different reasons, they would come to collect the bodies, the equipment, the propaganda value of American dead. She needed to be gone before that happened. Sarah surveyed the terrain. The road ran roughly north-south through a flat expanse of desert. To the east, boulder fields climbed toward distant mountains. To the west, open ground stretched toward a cluster of mud brick buildings, a village, maybe half a kilometer away. To the north, the direction the convoy had been traveling before the ambush, she could see the faint outline of another structure. Not a village, a single building. Closer, maybe 300 meters. She could make that. 300 meters in open desert, wounded, with enemies potentially watching. It should have taken her 5 minutes. It took 40. Sarah moved in short bursts, covering 15 to 20 meters at a time before dropping prone and scanning for threats. The pain was constant, her thigh throbbing even to the tourniquet, her ribs grinding with every crawl, but she'd been trained to operate through pain. Pain was information. Pain told you what was damaged and how badly. Pain kept you alert when exhaustion wanted to pull you under. She used the pain. She let it fuel her forward motion, converting agony into adrenaline, converting adrenaline into progress. Each meter was a victory. Each meter was proof that Captain Jake Reeves had been wrong. She was viable. The building resolved itself as she approached. A farmhouse, abandoned. The mud brick walls partially collapsed on the eastern side, the roof missing entirely over what had once been a living space. No doors, no windows, just empty frames that stared at her like hollow eye sockets. But the western corner was intact. The walls there rose to full height, maybe 12 feet, providing shade from the sun and concealment from observation. A pile of rubble blocked the obvious approach, which meant anyone looking for survivors wouldn't check here first. The terrain feature that had once been a courtyard would provide multiple egress routes if she needed to run. Not that running was an option. Sarah dragged herself into the shade and collapsed against the cool stone. For a long moment, she simply breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, slow, controlled. Her heart rate, which had been racing, began to settle. Her vision, which had been narrowing at the edges, began to clear. Her hands, which had been trembling, began to steady. She was alive. Against all odds, against all logic, against the judgment of a captain who decided her life wasn't worth the risk, she was alive. Now she had to stay that way. Sarah took stock of her situation. Primary weapon, lost. The M4A1 had been in the vehicle when it rolled, and she hadn't been able to locate it during her crawl to safety. Without it, her effective engagement range dropped from 300 meters to 30. Secondary weapon, functional. The 6 Sauer P226 was still holstered, undamaged, with 16 rounds available. Not enough for a sustained firefight, but enough for what came next if it came to that. Communications, compromised. Her tactical radio had been destroyed in the blast. The unit was still attached to her vest, but the casing was cracked and the display was dark. No way to reach the convoy. No way to reach FOB Phantom. No way to let anyone know she was still alive. Emergency beacon present. The PRC 112B survival radio was designed for exactly this scenario. Downed pilots, isolated operators, personnel separated from their units in hostile territory. It transmitted on a frequency monitored by CSAR teams, and it could be activated with the press of a single button. But activating it meant revealing her position. The beacon broadcast on 243.0 megahertz, the international emergency frequency. Anyone with the right equipment, including the enemy, could triangulate that signal. Activating it was a calculated risk, a bet that rescue would arrive before the people who wanted to kill her. Sarah's thumb hovered over the button. How long until rescue? FOB Phantom was 90 kilometers to the south. Even if they launched a QRF immediately, and that assumed someone at the FOB knew something was wrong, transit time would be at least 45 minutes. Add in mission planning, pre-flight checks, fuel load, and the inevitable bureaucratic delays that plague even the most urgent operations, and she was looking at 2 hours minimum. 2 hours with a tourniquet on her leg. 2 hours hiding in a ruined farmhouse. 2 hours hoping the enemy didn't return. Her thumb pressed a button. The beacon chirped once, confirming transmission, then went silent. The signal was broadcasting now, invisible pulses radiating outward at the speed of light, carrying coordinates that would appear on screens 90 kilometers away. If anyone was listening, Sarah settled back against the wall and checked her watch. 14:21 hours. The tourniquet had been on for 39 minutes. She had roughly 80 minutes before permanent damage became a concern. Less if the wound was worse than she'd assessed. More if she was lucky. She wasn't feeling lucky. The village she'd seen to the west showed no signs of activity. No smoke from cooking fires. No movement in the streets. No livestock or children or any of the normal indicators of inhabited space. Either the residents had fled when the ambush started, or the place had been abandoned long before. The boulder fields to the east were too far away to reach in her current condition. Even if she could make the distance, the terrain would be impossible to navigate with a leg that refused to bear weight. The farmhouse was her only option, so she stayed. She stayed and watched the sky for aircraft that didn't come. She stayed and listened for engines that didn't approach. She stayed and counted her rounds again and again, running through scenarios in her head like a gambler calculating odds. If 3 fighters returned, she could engage. 2 rounds per target, control pairs, 10 rounds remaining for follow-up. Acceptable. If 5 fighters returned, the math got harder. She might drop 3 before the rest found cover. Might. Assuming she hit with every shot. Assuming they didn't suppress a position, while flankers moved to her blind side. If more than 5 returned, she would save the last round. That was the agreement she'd made with herself years ago. The silent pact that every operator understood but rarely discussed. Capture was not an option. The things that happened to captured Americans in this part of the world were worse than death, and they lasted far longer. Better a quick end than months of propaganda videos, forced confessions, and systematic dismemberment. The last round would go in her own head before she let them take her alive. It wasn't fatalism. It was practicality. Sarah checked her watch again. 14:37. The beacon had been broadcasting for 16 minutes. The silence stretched on. She found herself thinking about her father. Master Chief Daniel Morrison had faced situations like this 3 times in his career. He'd told her about 2 of them, sanitized versions, appropriate for his teenage daughter, stripped of the worst details but still conveying the essential truth. Being left behind was the fear that haunted every operator. It was a nightmare that woke you at 0300, drenched in sweat, reaching for weapons that weren't there. The 3rd time, he'd never spoken about. Sarah only knew it existed because she'd found the after-action report years later, buried in classified archives she shouldn't have been accessing. The mission had been in Somalia, 1993, part of the operations that the public knew as Black Hawk Down. Her father's team had been pinned in a structure less than 200 meters from the crash site, taking fire from 3 directions, ammunition running low, casualties mounting. They'd been told that extraction was impossible. They'd been told to hold position until morning. They'd been told, essentially, to die. Her father had refused that order. He'd gathered the survivors, 6 operators and 2 wounded Delta soldiers who couldn't walk, and led them through 2 kilometers of hostile urban terrain in the middle of the night. He'd carried one of the wounded himself over one shoulder, firing his MP5 one-handed while bullets sparked off walls around him. He'd killed 11 enemy fighters that night, received wounds to his arm and leg, and delivered every single man to the extraction point alive. The commendation letter called it extraordinary heroism under fire. Her father had called it doing the job. Sarah understood that now. The job wasn't about following orders. It wasn't about adhering to protocols or satisfying mission parameters. The job was about bringing people home. It was about looking at the impossible situation and finding the narrow path through it. It was about refusing to quit even when every rational analysis said you should. Her father had done the job in Somalia. She would do it here. 12 hours. The beacon had been broadcasting for 51 minutes. Sarah's leg was completely numb now, the tourniquet doing its terrible work. She'd need to adjust it soon, loosen it for a few minutes to restore circulation, then tighten again before she bled out. The cycle could buy her another hour, maybe 2, but each iteration increased the risk of complications. She was reaching for the windlass when she heard engines, multiple vehicles, approaching from the south. Not helicopters. The sound signature was wrong. Ground vehicles, diesel moving fast. She estimated 4 to 6, based on the engine noise, which meant a convoy of some kind. The question was whose convoy? Sarah drew her pistol and moved to the corner of the farmhouse, using the rubble for cover. The numbness in her leg made movement awkward, but she forced herself into a stable firing position, weapon raised, sights aligned on the approach route. The first vehicle appeared through the heat shimmer. A Toyota Hilux pickup with a PK machine gun mounted in the bed. 2 fighters visible in the front, one on the gun, Taliban flags flapping from the antennas. The second vehicle was identical. The third was an old Soviet-era truck, covered bed, probably carrying additional personnel. Sarah counted 11 fighters visible. There could be more in the truck. The convoy wasn't heading toward her position. They were moving toward the ambush site, toward the burning vehicles and American dead. They were coming to collect their prizes, to strip weapons and ammunition, to photograph bodies for propaganda. They passed within 80 meters of the farmhouse. Sarah didn't move. She tracked them with her pistol, calculating angles, calculating distances, calculating the absolute futility of engaging. 11 confirmed targets, probably more in the truck. 2 vehicle-mounted machine guns capable of turning her position into splinters. The P2-26 held 16 rounds. She would not fire. The convoy reached the ambush site and stopped. Fighters dismounted, spreading out, picking through the wreckage. Someone was shouting orders. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. Search everything. Take everything. Leave nothing useful for the Americans. They would check the area. They would expand their search to nearby structures. They would find the farmhouse. They would find her. 23 hours. Sarah's mind raced through options. Run, impossible. Her leg couldn't bear weight, and she'd be visible the moment she left cover. They'd cut her down before she covered 50 meters. Hide, limited. The farmhouse offered concealment, not cover. The mud brick walls would stop small arms fire, but a PCAM would punch through them like paper. If they searched the building, she'd have seconds to react. Fight, suicidal. 16 rounds against a dozen fighters with machine guns. Even if she killed 3 or 4, the rest would overwhelm her position. Surrender, worse than death. One option remained. Sarah looked at her pistol. 15 rounds in the magazine. 1 in the chamber. 16 total. 1 for herself. That left 15 for everything else. She could wait until they came. Wait until they found her. Use those 15 rounds to take as many with her as possible before the last one ended it. It wasn't a good plan, but it was the only plan she had. The fighters were moving through the wreckage systematically, vehicle to vehicle, body to body. She watched one of them pull an American's dog tags off, hold them up like a trophy, then pocket them with a laugh. Another was photographing a corpse with a smartphone, angles calculated for maximum propaganda impact. These were the people who would find her. These were the people who would... The radio. Sarah's hand shot to her pocket, where she'd stowed the PRC 112B after activating the beacon. The radio had a receive function. If rescue was inbound, they'd try to contact her on the emergency frequency. She pulled the radio out, pressed it to her ear, and keyed the receive. Static. Then, Ghost, this is Phantom Actual. Do you copy? Ghost, this is Phantom Actual. The voice was Commander Webb's. Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs. Phantom Actual, this is Ghost, she whispered, keeping her voice as low as possible. I copy. What's your status? Ghost, be advised, QRF is airborne. We have 2 MH-60s with chalk of 8 each, plus Reaper and AC, 130 on station. ETA to your position is 19 minutes. Can you hold? 19 minutes. Sarah looked at the fighters searching the ambush site. They were less than 200 meters away, moving methodically, getting closer with each passing moment. Negative on position security, she transmitted. Approximately 1-2 tangos at the ambush site, 50 meters and closing. I am compromised in 15 minutes. Maybe less. Silence on the radio. Then, Ghost, understand you cannot hold. We are pushing assets. Spectre, 7 is eyes on. Can you mark your position? Negative on overt mark. They're too close. Anything visible draws fire. Copy. Stand by. The static returned. Sarah watched the fighters. They'd finished with the vehicles and were now spreading out, searching the perimeter. 2 of them were walking directly toward the farmhouse, flashlight in hand despite the afternoon sun. Weapons slung but ready. 150 meters. 100. 75. Ghost, Spectre. 7 has you on thermal. We see 2 approaching from your east. Recommend you displace the west side of structure. Maintain hard cover. Sarah moved. The pain was extraordinary. Her leg dragging behind her, ribs screaming with every motion, but she forced herself across the farmhouse interior, keeping the mud brick walls between herself and the approaching fighters. The western wall was intact, solid, providing concealment and marginal cover. Phantom Actual, I'm in position. Western side. Copy. Ghost, be advised. We're bringing Inspector 7 for show of force. Danger close. Keep your head down. Show of force. The words meant a Reaper drone, armed with Hellfire missiles and 500-pound GBU-38 dams, was about to make a very loud statement. Sarah pressed herself against the wall and covered her ears. The explosion was enormous. Even at 200 meters, even with solid cover, the concussion wave hit her like a physical blow. Dust cascaded from the walls. The ground shook. Secondary explosions followed, ammunition cooking off, fuel igniting, the Technical's mounted PKM firing wildly as heat detonated the rounds in its belt. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard screaming. Spectre 7, good effect on target. Ghost, what's your status? Sarah risked a look around the corner. The ambush site had become a hell of fire and smoke. One of the Technicals was completely destroyed. The dams must have caught it directly, and the Soviet truck was burning. Bodies lay scattered where the shrapnel had caught them. The surviving fighters were running, abandoning their vehicles, scattering into the desert. Phantom Actual, I'm still here. Tangos are displacing. Copy. QRF is 10 minutes out. Can you hold? I can hold. 10 minutes. Sarah sank back against the wall and let herself breathe. The radio crackled again. Ghost, Phantom Actual. Be advised. Convoy commander has reported your status as Kia. We are disregarding. But I need to know. How bad? Sarah looked at her leg. The pressure bandage was saturated with blood. The tourniquet was still tight, but she'd been wearing it for almost 2 hours now. Permanent nerve damage was becoming a real possibility. Her ribs were grinding with every breath, and she suspected she cracked at least one more during the crawl to safety. Functional, she transmitted, but I need immediate case vac. Tourniquet has been in place for 1 hour, 50 minutes. Copy, Ghost. Medevac is priority. We're bringing you home. The next 10 minutes felt like hours. Sarah kept the pistol in her hand, tracking any movement in the desert, ready to engage if any of the scattered fighters doubled back. But they didn't. The Reaper's strike had broken their will, sent them running for cover they'd never reach. Spectre 7 was hunting them now, thermal imaging tracking heat signatures across the barren landscape. The first hint of rescue was the sound. Rotors, distant at first, then growing, then unmistakable. The distinctive chop of MH 60 Blackhawks, the same sound that had preceded dozens of extractions throughout her career. She'd been on the delivering end of that sound many times, fast roping into compounds, suppressing enemy positions, pulling operators out of hot LZs. Now she was on the receiving end. The helicopters appeared over the ridgeline to the south, black against the bleached sky. 2 of them, fly in formation, door guns visible even at this distance. They banked toward the farmhouse, slowing, flaring for a tactical approach. Sarah keyed her radio. Phantom actual, I have eyes on QRF. Popping smoke. She pulled a purple smoke grenade from her vest, one of the few pieces of equipment that had survived the blast, and threw it into the courtyard. The colored plume rose immediately, marking her position for the incoming helicopters. Ghost, we see your smoke. Touchdown in 30 seconds. Stay down. The first Black Hawk came in fast, nose high, rotors clawing at the air. It settled into the courtyard with grace that belied its size, kicking up a dust storm that forced Sarah to shield her eyes. Before the wheels had fully touched down, figures were jumping from the cabin, operators in full kit, weapons up, scanning for threats. Ghost, where are you? She recognized the voice. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb, not commander. She'd gotten the rank wrong in her exhaustion, was crossing the courtyard to run. 2 operators flanking him. He was wearing civilian clothes under his plate carrier, which meant he dropped whatever he'd been doing the moment her beacon lit up. Here, she called. West wall. Webb reached her in seconds. His face, normally impassive, showed something she'd rarely seen. Relief. He knelt beside her, assessing her wounds with the practiced eye of a veteran. Talk to me, Ghost. Tourniquet on for 2 hours. Left thigh arterial. 2, maybe 3 broken ribs. Lost some blood. Lost more time. You're breathing and talking. That's what matters. He turned to the operators behind him. Get the stretcher. We're moving now. Sarah grabbed his arm. The convoy. Reeves. He left me. Webb's expression hardened. I know. We monitored the radio traffic. He reported you Kia without verification. He didn't check. He saw no patches and decided I wasn't worth the risk. That's a conversation for later. Right now, we're getting you out of here. Hands lifted her onto a stretcher. Pain flared through her ribs, but she gritted her teeth and held silent. The operators moved quickly, carrying her toward the waiting Black Hawk, boots churning through the sand. The door gunner watched the perimeter, M134 minigun tracking across potential threat zones. They loaded her into the cabin. Webb climbed in beside her, and the helicopter lifted immediately, banking hard to the south, putting distance between them and the kill zone. Loosen that tourniquet. Webb ordered one of the operators. 2 minutes, then retighten. She's been under too long. The relief when pressure released from her leg was almost as painful as the original wound. Blood rushed back into starved tissue, nerves screaming as sensation returned. Sarah closed her eyes. Ghost. She opened them. Webb was leaning close. You're going to be fine. You hear me? The best surgeons in theater are waiting. You're going to keep that leg, and you're going to keep that career, and when you're ready, his jaw tightened. When you're ready, Reeves is going to answer for what he did. Sarah's vision was starting to fade. The blood loss, the trauma, the adrenaline crash. It was all catching up at once. He said I was non-viable, she whispered. He was wrong. The Black Hawk's interior blurred. Voices shouted around her. Medics calling vitals. Webb coordinating with the surgical team. The crew chief reporting their ETA. She heard someone say hypotensive. Heard someone else say transfusion. Heard the steady mechanical rhythm of equipment being prepared. Her heart stuttered. She's coding. Starting compressions. Hands pressed against her chest. The pain was distant now, separated from her by a growing fog. She was floating, watching from above, seeing the operators working frantically to keep her alive. Push AP. Get that IO in. I need access now. Someone was counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Compressions delivered with brutal efficiency. Ribs straining under the force. Still no pulse. Charged to 200. The shock hit her like lightning. Her body arched off the stretcher, muscles convulsing. Heart jolted by electricity. The fog receded. The pain rushed back. She was gasping, coughing alive. We have rhythm. Sinus Tatch 132. Keep that AP running. What's our ETA? 4 minutes. Sarah's eyes found Webb's face. He was still there, still watching, still refusing to look away. Stay with me, Ghost. She wanted to answer. She wanted to tell him that she wasn't giving up, that she hadn't crawled 300 meters through hostile territory just to die in the back of a helicopter. But the words wouldn't come. Her mouth was too dry, her tongue too heavy, her thoughts too scattered. So she nodded, just once, and then her heart stopped again. Damn it, she's in V-fib. The next few minutes existed only in fragments. Paddles pressing against her chest. The acrid smell of something burning. Her skin, maybe, where the defibrillator made contact. Voices arguing about medication dosages, about fluid volumes, about whether she could survive another shock. She heard someone say losing her. She heard someone say not today. She heard Webb's voice cutting through everything. She survived 4 hours in a kill zone. She's not dying, my bird. The helicopter banked hard. Through the open door, she glimpsed something. Buildings, vehicles, people running. A helipad. Medical personnel in surgical gowns, waiting. They'd arrived. The landing was rough. The stretcher was moving before the rotors stopped spinning. Carried by hands, she couldn't count toward a building she couldn't identify. Bright lights. Cold air. The sharp smell of antiseptic. Then darkness. When Sarah Morrison woke up, 3 days had passed. She was in a hospital bed at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, the primary treatment facility for wounded service members evacuated from Iraq and Afghanistan. The room was small but private, filled with equipment she recognized from her combat medic training. For stands, cardiac monitors, pulse oximeters, a mechanical ventilator that had apparently been removed at some point before she regained consciousness. Her leg was still attached. That was the first thing she checked. The limb was wrapped in bandages from mid-thigh to knee, elevated on a foam support, connected to a drain that was pulling fluid from the surgical site. It hurt, a deep, throbbing ache that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. But it was there. It was functional. It was hers. You're awake. Webb was sitting in a chair by the window. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Uniform rumpled, eyes red-rimmed, coffee cup cooling on the windowsill beside him. But his voice was steady, and his face showed nothing but professional concern. How long? She managed. 3 days. You've been in and out. Mostly out. He stood, moving to her bedside. Do you remember what happened? Fragments. The ambush. The crawl. The farmhouse. The helicopters. Beyond that, only darkness and dreams. You coded twice in the bird. Webb said. Your heart stopped for a combined total of 6 minutes. The surgical team worked on you for 8 hours. You lost 5 liters of blood and received 12 units of transfusion. By all rights, you should be dead. Sarah processed that information. But I'm not. No, you're not. Webb's expression shifted. Something fierce, something proud. You held position in hostile territory for 4 hours with a tourniquet on and enemies 50 meters away. You stayed conscious when anyone else would have blacked out. You made yourself viable when someone had already written you off. The words triggered memory. Reeves. What happened to him? Webb's jaw tightened. Captain Jake Reeves is currently under investigation. Your beacon transmission was logged. Your medical status was documented. Multiple members of his convoy have given statements confirming that he ordered the retreat without verifying your condition. He left me to die. He made a decision under fire. That decision is being reviewed by his chain of command. Webb paused. But there's more. More. Reeves didn't just leave you. He reported you killed in action. He filed paperwork stating that you were a Jane Doe casualty with no identifying information, recommending no recovery effort due to hostile activity in the area. Sarah felt cold. He was covering his tracks. That's one interpretation. Another is that he panicked and tried to make the problem go away. Webb's voice hardened. Either way, he's done. The investigation will take time, but the outcome is already decided. He left an American behind. In this community, that's unforgivable. I don't want vengeance. The words surprised her even as she said them. Webb raised an eyebrow. I don't, Sarah repeated. He made a bad call. People make bad calls in combat. I've made bad calls. The difference is accountability. She paused, searching for the right words. I want him to face what he did. I want him to understand the weight of it. But I don't want to destroy him for my satisfaction. What do you want? Sarah thought about the question for a long moment. I want the system to work. I want the rules to mean something. I want the next operator who ends up in my position to know that they won't be abandoned because they don't have the right patch on their shoulder. Webb nodded slowly. Then you're going to get a chance to make that happen. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. JAG wants your testimony. The investigation is proceeding as a potential court-martial. Your statement will be central to the case. Sarah took the envelope. When you're ready. But Ghost, Webb met her eyes. Whatever you decide to say, make sure it's the truth. Not what you think they want to hear. Not what makes Reeves look worse or better. Just the truth. Truth. It was such a simple word. Sarah had spent her entire career in the shadows, dealing in information that was classified, sanitized, need to know. She'd operated in gray zones where the truth was malleable, where official narratives diverged from ground reality, where the stories told the public bore little resemblance to what actually happened. Now she was being asked to speak plainly. No classification, no redaction, no protective anonymity, just the truth. The court-martial convened 6 weeks later. Sarah had spent that time recovering. Physical therapy 3 times a day, learning to walk again, strengthening muscles that had atrophied, rebuilding a leg that surgeons had fought so hard to save. The nerve damage was permanent but manageable. She lost some sensation in her lower thigh and knee, but motor function was intact. She would run again. She would deploy again, if she wanted to. That question haunted her through the recovery process. She'd given everything to the teams. She'd sacrificed relationships, stability, any semblance of normal life. She'd seen things that would never leave her memory, done things that required compartmentalization to survive. She'd earned her place through years of struggle, and she'd proven her worth in operations that would remain classified until long after she was dead. And then, in one moment of chaos, all of that had become invisible. Reeves hadn't seen a SEAL. He'd seen a body without identification. He'd seen a problem without a solution. He'd made a calculation, resources versus return, and decided that her life wasn't worth the risk. That calculation had been wrong, but it had been made. And somewhere in other kill zones, other decisions were being made. Other commanders were looking at wounded soldiers and deciding who was worth saving. Other criteria were being applied, consciously or unconsciously, that had nothing to do with the value of the human being bleeding out in the sand. Sarah wanted to change that. The military courtroom at Fort Bragg was austere and formal. Wooden benches, American flags, the seal of the Army Judge Advocate General's Corps displayed prominently above the judge's seat. Captain Jake Reeves sat at the defense table, dressed in his service uniform, looking smaller than she remembered. His attorney was a major with combat ribbons on her chest, and the sharp eyes of someone who'd fought cases like this before. The prosecution was led by a lieutenant colonel named Patricia Hayes. Hayes had interviewed Sarah 3 times during the investigation, each session more detailed than the last. She'd walked through the timeline of the ambush, the decisions made, the radio traffic recorded, the medical documentation of Sarah's wounds. She'd been thorough, professional, and relentless. Now she was calling Sarah to the stand. Please state your name and service branch for record. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, United States Navy, Naval Special Warfare Development Group. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Most of the observers were Army, officers, JAG personnel, some senior enlisted who'd been following the case. They knew DevGru by reputation, the unit that had killed Osama bin Laden, the Tier 1 counterterrorism force that handled missions too dangerous or sensitive for anyone else. They hadn't expected one of those operators to be the victim in this case. Hayes let the reaction settle before continuing. Lieutenant Morrison, you were assigned to a convoy on the date in question. Can you describe your role? I was embedded as a liaison officer from a joint task force. My actual mission was classified at the time. I was operating under covert protocols that required me to remove all identifying insignia from my uniform. Was Captain Reeves aware of your actual status? Negative. He was told I was a liaison. He was not told my unit or my operational specialty. After the ambush, what was your condition? I had sustained penetrating trauma to my left thigh with arterial involvement, multiple rib fractures, and various lacerations from shrapnel. I was conscious but unable to move independently. What happened next? Sarah described the scene. The The burning vehicles, the enemy fire, the approach of Captain Reeves and his team. She recounted the examination, the fingers on her pulse, the assessment of her status, the decision. She's not ours. She's non-viable. Leave her. The words hung in the courtroom. How did you respond to being left behind? I improvised. I applied a tourniquet, packed my wound with hemostatic gauze, and crawled approximately 300 meters to a collapsed building. I activated my emergency beacon and waited for rescue. How long were you alone in hostile territory? Approximately 4 hours. And during that time, what threats did you face? Sarah described the enemy fighters searching the ambush site, the execution she'd heard, the moment when one of them had walked within 10 feet of her position. She described the convoy of technicals that arrived later, the fighters who'd approached the farmhouse, the Reaper strike that had scattered them. You were eventually extracted by a quick reaction force. Can you describe your condition at that time? Critical. My tourniquet had been in place for approximately 2 hours. I was hypovolemic, bordering on shock. I coded twice en route to the surgical facility. Your heart stopped. Yes, ma'am. Twice. Hayes paused, letting the testimony resonate. Lieutenant Morrison, in your professional opinion, as someone trained in combat medicine and tactical decision-making, was there an alternative to Captain Reeves's decision? Sarah had thought about this question for 6 weeks. Yes, she said. There were alternatives. Can you describe them? The convoy had multiple vehicles capable of transport. My wounds, while serious, were survivable with immediate intervention. A 30-second assessment, checking airway, breathing, circulation, would have revealed that I was viable. Captain Reeves made his decision based on my lack of identifying insignia, not on my medical status. Are you saying he left you because he didn't know who you were? I'm saying that my identity or lack of visible identity influenced his triage decision. He categorized me as not ours before he categorized me as wounded. The first determination drove the second. Hayes nodded. No further questions. The defense attorney rose. She was skilled. Sarah had to acknowledge that. She spent the next hour attempting to contextualize Reeves's decision, the chaos of the ambush, the need to evacuate multiple casualties, the tactical pressure of remaining in a kill zone. She brought up Sarah's own words from a written statement about the difficulty of triage decisions in combat, but she couldn't escape the central fact. Reeves had left a viable American soldier behind because he'd assumed she was someone else's problem. When the defense finished, Sarah was excused from the stand. She sat in the gallery and watched the remainder of the proceedings. Reeves did not testify. His attorney called character witnesses, fellow officers who spoke of his dedication, his competence, his record of service. They painted a picture of a man who'd made one mistake in an otherwise exemplary career, who deserved consideration for the pressures he'd faced, who would carry the weight of his decision for the rest of his life. Sarah believed them. She believed that Reeves was haunted by what he'd done. She believed he'd replay that moment endlessly, wondering what he could have done differently, knowing that a different choice might have changed everything. But belief didn't equal absolution. The verdict came 2 days later. This court finds Captain Jake Reeves guilty of dereliction of duty, resulting in serious injury or harm to another service member. The sentence was dismissal from the service, the officer equivalent of a dishonorable discharge. Reeves stood at attention as the judgment was read, his face carefully neutral. But Sarah saw something in his eyes, not relief, not defiance, something closer to acceptance. He'd known this was coming. He'd known, perhaps, that it should come. After proceedings, she found him outside the courtroom. He saw her approach and stiffened, clearly expecting confrontation. His attorney moved to intervene, but Reeves held up a hand, stopping her. Lieutenant Morrison, Captain Reeves. They stood in silence for a long moment. I don't have excuses, Reeves said finally. I had seconds to decide, and I decided wrong. I looked at you and I saw someone who wasn't my responsibility, someone I could leave without consequence. His voice cracked. There's no version of that decision I can live with. Then don't try to live with it. Reeves looked at her, confused. I mean it, Sarah continued. Don't try to carry it. Don't try to make peace with it. Let it change you. She paused. You made a choice that nearly killed me. That choice was wrong. But the choice itself isn't what defines you. What defines you is what you do next. I don't understand. You're being dismissed. Your career is over. That's the consequence. Sarah met his eyes. But the lesson isn't about punishment. The lesson is about seeing people. You didn't see me as a person. You saw me as a category. Not ours. Non-viable. Labels that made it easier to leave. That's not. Reeves stopped. Swallowed. That's exactly what I did. So change it. Spend the rest of your life seeing people. Every person. Even the ones without patches. Even the ones who look like someone else's problem. Sarah stepped back. That's how you make this mean something. Not by suffering. By learning. She turned and walked away. Reeves didn't follow. 2 months later, Sarah returned to active duty. The leg was strong enough. The ribs had healed. The nerve damage was manageable. A slight numbness that would remind her forever of that day in the desert, but nothing that impaired her effectiveness. But she didn't return to operations. She returned to training. The selection and training detachment at DevGru was responsible for finding and developing the next generation of operators. It was where candidates were assessed, pushed, broken, or built, the crucible that separated those who could from those who couldn't. Sarah had been through that crucible herself. Now she would forge others. Her first class arrived on a Tuesday morning. 42 candidates. Navy SEALs who'd already proven themselves in conventional teams and wanted to advance to Tier 1. They were young, fit, confident, exactly what she'd been a decade earlier. They looked at her with curiosity, some with skepticism. A female instructor, in this program, teaching them. She gathered them in the briefing room. My name is Lieutenant Morrison, call sign Ghost. She paused, letting them process. Some of you are wondering why I'm here instead of operational. Some of you are wondering if I can actually teach you anything. Let me address both. She pulled up an image on the screen. Behind her, a satellite photo, desert terrain, burning vehicles. 6 months ago, I was left behind by a convoy commander who decided I wasn't worth saving. I spent 4 hours alone in hostile territory with a tourniquet on my leg and enemies within spitting distance. I coded twice before reaching surgical. She let that sink in. I am here to make sure none of you ever face what I faced. And I am here to make sure if you do, you survive it. The skepticism in the room had vanished. The program you're entering will test everything you think you know. It will break your assumptions about your limits. It will expose weaknesses you didn't know you had. Sarah stepped forward. But more than that, it will teach you to see the wounded operator who doesn't look like one, to see the threat that doesn't fit your expectations, to see the person, not the category. She looked at each candidate in turn. Because categories kill. They killed almost me, and I will not let them kill any of you. The training began that day. Sarah drove them hard, harder, some said, than any instructor they'd ever faced. She demanded perfection in tactics, precision in execution, and above all, awareness. Awareness of teammates, of civilians, of anyone who might be caught in the chaos of operations. But she also taught them something else. She taught them to verify. The Morrison Protocol, as it came to be called, required pulse and identification verification for any presumed Kia before evacuation. No more non-viable decisions based on missing patches. No more categorization by appearance. Every body got checked. Every pulse got confirmed. Every American got a chance. The protocol spread beyond DevGru. Other units adopted it. Training programs incorporated it. Slowly, across the special operation community and then the broader military, the standard changed. Years later, Sarah would receive reports of soldiers saved because someone had checked twice. Operators who'd lost consciousness, been presumed dead, and been recovered because the person making the call had remembered. Verify first. It wasn't redemption. Sarah didn't believe in redemption. Not the clean, Hollywood version where past trauma was resolved by future success. The scar on her thighs still ached when the weather changed. The nightmares still came sometimes, placing her back in the sand with the footsteps approaching. She still woke, occasionally reaching for a pistol that wasn't there. But it was meaning. The suffering she'd endured hadn't been for nothing. It had changed something. It had saved lives that would never know her name. That was enough. On a morning 5 years after the ambush, Sarah Morrison stood at the edge of the training compound in Virginia Beach. The sun was rising over the Atlantic, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. She'd always loved sunrises, the the reminder that darkness ended, that each day offered a fresh start, that survival was its own kind of victory. She was no longer an operator. The leg had finally caught up with her, not failing, exactly, but no longer meeting the standard required for combat deployment. She transitioned to a permanent training role, shaping candidates who would go on to conduct operations she'd once led. It was different, but it was still service. A young operator approached her, Petty Officer First Class Marcus Chun, one of her former students, now assigned to a squadron conducting real-world missions. Lieutenant Morrison? Just Sarah now. I'm retired. She smiled slightly. Paperwork came through last week. Chun nodded. He looked nervous, which was unusual for someone who performed with distinction in some of the most dangerous environments on Earth. I wanted to thank you, he said, for what you taught me. You passed selection. You trained. You qualified. The credit is yours, not just the training. Chun hesitated. There was an operation last month. Compound in Syria. We took fire during extraction. One of the assault team went down, no pulse, no response. I thought he was gone. Sarah waited. But I checked, like you taught us. I checked twice. Chen's voice tightened. He was in V-fib. No radial pulse, but carotid was there. We got him to surgical. He's alive because I didn't assume. Sarah felt something shift in her chest. What's his name? Petty Officer Rodriguez. He's still in recovery, but the doctors say full prognosis. Chun met her eyes. He's alive because of what happened to you. Because you turned it into something. Because you taught us to verify. Sarah looked out at the sunrise. Rodriguez. A name she didn't know. A face she'd never seen. A life continuing because of ripples set in motion by her suffering. Tell him, she said quietly, that he's worth saving. Tell him that someone decided he was worth the effort and that he should spend the rest of his life proving them right. Chun nodded. He turned to leave, then paused. Ghost. Sarah looked back. We still tell your story. Every new class. The candidates hear about what happened, about what you survived, about the protocol. Chun straightened. They know your name. They know what you did, and they carry it with them. Sarah watched him go. The sun was fully above the horizon now, the sky shifting from gold to pale blue. She thought about her father. Master Chief Daniel Morrison had spent his life in service, giving everything, receiving little, dying young, because some wounds couldn't be healed. He'd never seen her pin on the Trident. He'd never watched her deploy with the most elite fighting force in American history. He'd never known that his daughter would follow his path, exceed his achievements, and transform his legacy into something larger than either of them. But maybe he knew now. Sarah didn't believe in ghosts. The irony of her call sign wasn't lost on her, but she believed in continuity. The things we did echoed forward, shaping futures we'd never see. Her father had shaped her. She had shaped Chun. Chun had saved Rodriguez. Rodriguez would go on to do something that mattered, and the chain would continue, link by link, extending into a future where she was just a story that candidates heard during training. That was immortality, not the kind that defied death, but the kind that gave death meaning. Sarah Morrison left the compound that morning and drove to a small cemetery on the outskirts of Virginia Beach. Her father's grave was simple, white marble, standard military issue, engraved with his name, rank, and dates. A small American flag stood beside it, planted there by some veteran she'd never met who visited regularly. She knelt in the grass. Hey, Dad. The wind stirred. The flag fluttered. I did the thing. The impossible thing you always said I could do. Sarah paused. I made it matter. She stayed there for a long time, not speaking, not praying, just present. The morning light warmed her face. The sounds of the city woke around her. Somewhere, men and women in uniform were preparing for missions that would test everything they had. She had been one of them. She had given everything she had. And now, finally, she could rest. Sarah's story shows us that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about transforming pain into purpose and making sure no one else has to suffer what we suffered. If this kept you engaged, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in those 4 hours alone? Subscribe if you haven't already. More stories like this are coming. See you in the next one. The military would go on without her. New candidates would enter selection. New operators would earn their tridents. New missions would be planned and executed, new enemies neutralized, new victories won in shadows that the public would never see. And somewhere, in training rooms across the special operations community, instructors would tell a story. The story of a woman who was left behind, who was judged non-viable by a commander who couldn't see past her missing patches, who crawled 300 meters with a tourniquet on her leg, who survived 4 hours alone with enemies all around, who died twice in a helicopter and came back both times, who testified with truth instead of vengeance, who changed a protocol that saved lives she'd never meet, who became, in the end, exactly what her call's sign suggested, a ghost who haunted the conscience of everyone who heard her story, a reminder that every person matters, a lesson that some things, honor, duty, the refusal to leave anyone behind, are worth dying for, and worth living for, too. Ghost.